You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel like wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I like to call redacted history. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 322 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast.
As you guys will recall, we ended the last episode with the death of Federal First Corps Commander Major General John Reynolds on the morning of Wednesday, July 1st, 1863, on the western outskirts of the town of Gettysburg, as he sent some Iron Brigade soldiers charging into the Herbst woodlot against the Confederates who were already there, advancing through the trees. His last words were reportedly, "Forward, men, forward for God's sake, and drive those fellows out of those woods."
To relieve Buford's beleaguered Union cavalrymen on McPherson's Ridge, Reynolds had just finished ordering the leading elements of his First Corps to take up positions just north of the Herbst woodlot and also over north of the Chambersburg Pike. That was Cutler's brigade from Wadsworth's division and Hall's battery. Reynolds had then ridden back south of the Chambersburg Pike to direct Wadsworth's 2nd Brigade, the Iron Brigade, into action.
Rebel soldiers from Archer's brigade had already crossed Willoughby Run and were coming up through the Herbst woodlot, driving Buford's troopers before them, and so John Reynolds knew there was no time to lose. It was going to be close, very close. Not wasting a moment, just as soon as the men of the regiment at the head of the double-quicking Iron Brigade column, the 2nd Wisconsin, had hastily formed into line of battle, Reynolds immediately sent them charging straight into the trees to check the Confederate advance. Then, as he turned in his saddle to look for the next Iron Brigade unit coming up, Reynolds was shot in the back of the neck and killed instantly.
We wanted to mention here that we'd like to tell you what time John Reynolds was killed that morning. In fact, we'd like to give you precise times for all the major events we talk about during the battle. But the truth is, we can't.
In fact, other than knowing the times of sunrise and sunset on the 3 days of the battle, no one knows precisely when anything really happened. That means if someone says such and such happened at 10:15 a.m. or this happened at 3:30 in the afternoon, well, you need to keep in mind that those are just guesstimates.
At the beginning of his book, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, Allen Guelzo writes, quote, "America in the 1860s knew nothing about synchronized time. Clocks and watches were set by light and dark. There were no time zones, no standardized time measurement schemes. Even meticulous timekeepers relied on the sound of church bells or public clocks. Of course, in the midst of the battle, few people were noticing bells, if they were being rung at all, and few were likely to be listening for the cheerful chiming of a courthouse clock. Soldiers set their personal watches by their own estimates, and in battle, those lacking watches were reduced to little more than a hazardous guess about the time."
All of that's to say that when you hear us report that something happened at a certain time, you'll probably notice we'll be hedging a bit by saying something like it happened around 9:30, or about 3 o'clock, or sometime between 1 and 1:30. And then as for the death of John Reynolds, well, we think that happened around 10:15 that morning.
John Reynolds obviously placed a great deal of importance on maintaining control of John Herbst park-like woodlot there on McPherson's Ridge. This can be seen in the fact that, rather than waiting for the regiments of the Iron Brigade to arrive on the scene and form a brigade line of battle so they could all go in at once, Reynolds instead hurriedly sent the 1st Regiment to arrive, the 2nd Wisconsin, charging straight into the trees to check the Confederate advance.
Reynolds' last words were directed at the men of the 2nd Wisconsin, urging them forward to drive the rebels out of the Herbst woodlot. But just what was so important about that patch of trees? Well, to understand the importance of Farmer Herbst's woodlot, you need to understand the lay of the land there on the western outskirts of town. So you can either open up your Gettysburg Atlas of choice, or in that map in your mind's eye, you can picture the north-south running line of McPherson's Ridge, with to the south the Fairfield Road where it comes into Gettysburg, and then to the north the Chambersburg Pike where it approaches town. Between those two roads is the Herbst woodlot.
From the federal perspective, to the right, or just north of the woodlot, was the McPherson Farm, and to the right of that was the Chambersburg Pike. Over on the other side of the pike, an unfinished railroad bed, which formed a deep cut in places, ran parallel to the road.
Beyond that, and north of another patch of woods, was yet another of those roads that ran into Gettysburg from all points of the compass, the Mummasburg Road. And just on the other side of that road was an elevation known locally as Oak Hill, whose height allowed it to dominate the surrounding countryside. If you visit the battlefield today and head out to the Eternal Light Peace Memorial, well, you're standing on Oak Hill. And as you take in the view from there to the south, you can really appreciate the importance of that spot on July 1st.
Reynolds wanted Wadsworth's division to secure the ridgeline as far northward as they dared, so Wadsworth placed 3 of Cutler's regiments north of the Chambersburg Pike and deployed them into line, while Cutler's other 2 regiments would cover the McPherson farm buildings on the south side of the pike. The Iron Brigade would push forward on the left of Cutler's 2 regiments at the farm buildings and clear the Herbst woodlot.
In his book, The Gettysburg Campaign, A Study in Command, Edwin Coddington pointed out that, quote, Reynolds had good reason for wanting to hold McPherson's Ridge in spite of certain weaknesses in the position. As long as the enemy came from the west, it adequately covered the approaches to the town. The stand of timber in approximately the center of the ridge...
This was the Herbst woodlot.
Right. But Coddington continues, quote, the stand of timber in approximately the center of the ridge afforded protection for occupying forces because they could send an enfilading fire on enemy columns moving along either the Chambersburg Pike or the Fairfield Road, or both at once. The greatest defect of the position was the exposure of its right flank to artillery fire from Oak Hill to the north, and attacks from infantry which could use the nearby fields of tall wheat as a cover for their movements.
And then in his book on Gettysburg, Stephen Sears writes, quote, it was evident to both sides that a key to the McPherson Ridge position was the 5-acre woodlot adjacent to the McPherson farm buildings that would serve as a kind of redoubt for whichever side held it.
So, with the Herbst woodlot being a key to the McPherson Ridge position, and with the Confederates of Archer's brigade already moving through the trees from the west, John Reynolds' last act before being killed was to send the Iron Brigade charging in from the east to battle with the rebels for control of that important piece of terrain.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics, we go back to source materials in their original languages,
and we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast,
wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
History never says goodbye. It just says, see you later. Edward Galeano was right when he said that. Events keep happening over and over again in some form. And that's the reason I produced the podcast, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. What is it? We take stories of history and apply them to the events of today to help you, perhaps, understand them better. We are also part of Airwave Media Network. I've been doing the program since 2006. That's a long time, and the show has a long name. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Find me wherever you get podcasts.
We had been in line of battle but a short time after our battery took position until the order was given, forward. As we emerged into the open field, a Federal battery saluted us with a shower of shells. Our line of advance placed the 13th on a direct line between the Federal and Confederate batteries. The descent to Willoughby Run is a gradual slope with a dip about 150 yards from the stream, so our battery could not engage the Federal guns until we had gone about a half mile down the slope. As soon as we were below the range of our guns, they fired a volley at the Federal battery, and I thought it the sweetest music I'd ever heard as the shells went whizzing just above our heads.
At the second volley from our battery, I saw one of the Federal guns topple and fall to the ground. This raised a terrible rebel yell all along the line. I was the color guard on the left of the color bearer, Tom Grant. He was a big, double-jointed 6-footer, and having that morning partaken freely of Pennsylvania rye or apple juice, he was waving the flag and howling at the top of his voice, making a fine target while the shells were flying thick around us. I said, "Tom, if you don't stop that, I will use my bayonet on you." Just then a shower of rifle balls from the Federals greeted us, and Tom needed no further admonition from me.
We were now in easy range of the Federals across the run, who were firing on us, but not advancing. We continued to advance, but in a walk, loading and firing as we went, until we reached a strip of low land along the stream. There we were protected from the fire of the enemy by an abrupt rise across the run in our front. We halted to reform, reload, catch our breath, and cool off a little. It was but 9 o'clock in the morning, and hottest.
While we were engaged, the Tennesseans on our left advanced. They were hotly engaged at close quarters, the Yanks charging them in column. At this stage, Colonel George rode down the line to the right and requested General Archer or Colonel Aiken, they were close together, to left wheel the 13th Alabama Regiment so as to crossfire on the Federals in front of the Tennesseans. This move placed the right of our regiment on or near the crest of the ridge and about 75 yards from the Bluecoats, into whom we were pouring volley after volley as fast as we could shoot. We were rather enjoying the fray when the order was given, "Fall back to Willoughby Run." Private William H. Moon, 13th Alabama Infantry, Archer's Brigade, Hill's Corps.
As we learned in the last episode, Brigadier General James Archer, commanding the brigade of Confederate infantry south of the Chambersburg Pike that was pushing across Willoughby Run and into the Herbst woodlot from the west, had wanted to wait for supports to come up before he advanced across the stream and into the trees ahead. Archer was a veteran officer, and his instincts and experience told him there was a good chance that trouble lay ahead. But his division commander, Major General Henry Heath, had impatiently dismissed Archer's concerns and ordered him to continue his advance.
And so, despite his misgivings, Archer advanced across Willoughby Run and then into the Herbst woodlot, chasing away the last of Buford's Federal cavalrymen positioned in the woods. Archer moved forward with the 7th Tennessee at the northern end of his line of battle, nearest to the Chambersburg Pike, with the 14th Tennessee to its right, then the 1st Tennessee and the 13th Alabama, while the men of the 5th Alabama Battalion remained out in front, deployed as skirmishers.
Before proceeding across the stream and into the trees beyond, Archer made sure his entire command was aligned before he ordered it forward. But in the advance east from Willoughby Run, the brigade's alignment was quickly broken up. The left regiment, the 7th Tennessee, was slowed by the broken ground of a small quarry they stumbled upon. Then the Tennesseans were brought to a halt by disciplined volleys from the Federal soldiers at the southern end of Cutler's line, the 14th Brooklyn and the 95th New York, who were deployed around the McPherson farm buildings on the south side of the Chambersburg Pike.
The next regiment in Archer's line, the 14th Tennessee, continued pushing steadily forward into the Herbst woodlot, with the terrain and trees screening them from the sight of Cutler's Federals at the McPherson farm. The actions of Archer's two right regiments, the 1st Tennessee and 13th Alabama, served to further break up his line, as the 1st Tennessee went to ground to avoid the blasts of canister from a 2-gun section of Lieutenant John Califf's horse artillery, while the 13th Alabama eased south in order to have a go at taking those unprotected Union guns from their vulnerable flank. Archer, who was making the advance dismounted, found himself moving forward between the 1st Tennessee and 13th Alabama.
Meanwhile, the Federal infantrymen of Wadsworth's other brigade were approaching at a run. The 2nd Wisconsin, in the lead, was met by one of Wadsworth's aides, a fellow named Kress, as the regiment reached the seminary grounds. Kress yelled for the men to fix bayonets and form line of battle, adding, "You have not a second to lose. The enemy are upon you."
Kress told Colonel Lucius Fairchild, commanding the 2nd, that he was to, quote, form his regiment forward into line, double quick, and that Fairchild could expect to encounter the enemy, quote, in his immediate front as soon as he could form.
All of that meant that James Archer's instincts had been correct after all. There was trouble ahead, because unfortunately for Archer and his men, they were about to find themselves caught up in a battle for the Herbst woodlot, not with some local militia or dismounted Union cavalry, but with some of the hardest fighting soldiers in the enemy army, the black-hatted Westerners of the 1st Brigade, 1st Division, 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac, the Iron Brigade.
The Army of the Potomac's only all-Western brigade, the Iron Brigade, included the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin, the 19th Indiana, and the 24th Michigan. One of their early brigade commanders, back in the spring of 1862, had been John Gibbon, an outstanding officer who both trained them well and also insisted on their unique appearance.
While the rest of the Army was adopting the less dressy uniform of sack coats and kepi headgear, Gibbon had insisted that his men wear the longer regulation dress frock coat and the regular U.S. Army's black hardee hat, a broad-brimmed, high-crowned hat worn with one side of the brim pinned up. Although they were the cause of much grumbling at first, the uniforms became a badge of honor and the source of one of the unit's nicknames, the Black Hat Brigade.
The iron in their other nickname had come from a comment by former Army Commander George McClellan and had been confirmed by their remarkable fighting qualities at places like Bronner's Farm and Antietam. At any rate, Gibbon had since been promoted to other responsibilities, and Brigadier General Solomon Meredith now commanded the Iron Brigade. At 6 feet 7 inches tall, Meredith, known as Long Sol, looked imposing, but unfortunately his military abilities didn't match his height.
The 53-year-old Meredith was a farmer and Indiana politician who had used his Republican political connections to first secure an assignment as colonel of the 19th Indiana, and then promotion to brigadier general in command of the Iron Brigade.
As colonel of the 19th Indiana, Meredith's lack of ability and skill as an officer caused quite a bit of discontent in the ranks. In October 1861, the regimental surgeon reported to Oliver Morton, Indiana's wartime governor, that, quote, "Our colonel has no practical sense. The officers have all found it out. Lieutenant Colonel is a good man, or we would have all gone to the sticks before now. Bad administration is seen and felt throughout all the regiment."
There was apparently a conspiracy amongst the officers of the 19th to help get Meredith promoted to brigadier general so that he would be taken away from the regiment. In fact, when John Gibbon was promoted to command of a division in another corps, Meredith himself lobbied shamelessly for Gibbon's old post, and his political connections worked wonders, catapulting him to command of the Iron Brigade. When Gibbon learned of this, he was incensed that somehow Army headquarters had, quote, put that fine body of men in charge of an incompetent brigadier general.
Meredith's first battle as commander of the Iron Brigade was at Fredericksburg in December 1862, where, even though the brigade wasn't heavily engaged, Meredith still managed to irritate Division Commander Abner Doubleday to such an extent that he relieved Long Sol of command on the spot. The demotion was only temporary, though, and Meredith was back at the head of the Iron Brigade during the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863. 2 of his regiments crossed the Rappahannock in boats under fire. They suffered around 60 casualties, but established a bridgehead on the far shore. Meredith came across shortly thereafter, standing in one of the boats and hurrahing. However, a change of orders pulled Long Sol and his men back across the river and ended their participation in the campaign. All of that's to say that as the Iron Brigade marched toward Gettysburg, Solomon Meredith still hadn't proven himself a capable brigade commander.
We bring all of that up because Meredith, despite leading the famed Iron Brigade into battle at Gettysburg, is hardly mentioned in most of the accounts that you'll read of the fighting on July 1st. This lack of airtime, so to speak, is very noticeable and seems highly unusual until you dig a bit deeper into the story and find out Long Sol Meredith really had no business leading men into combat as a brigade commander.
Apparently, Meredith was riding at the rear of the brigade column as his men rushed up to the seminary and went regiment by regiment straight into the fight for the Herbst woodlot. As we'll see, the Iron Brigade, evidently with little input from Long Sol, will trounce Archer's Confederates, and in fact, their successful attack will carry them quite a ways forward before Meredith will pull the brigade back. It was at that point, when he was reforming his line, that a shell exploded near him.
According to an August 28th issue of an Indiana newspaper, Meredith, quote, was struck in the head by a fragment of the shell and stunned. At the same moment, his horse was struck and fell dead, his body crushing the general's leg and side frightfully. The wound in the head fractured the skull and affected the brain very seriously. The fall broke several ribs and tore them loose from the breastbone, and so seriously injured the right leg that it is yet, after nearly 2 months, greatly discolored." End quote.
The Battle of Gettysburg was over for Long Saul. Significantly, the Iron Brigade's regimental commanders said little about him in their after-action reports. Division Commander James Wadsworth didn't even mention Meredith in his report, and temporary commander of the 1st Corps, Abner Doubleday, only discussed him in connection with his injury. Meredith himself never wrote a battle report.
As the 2nd Wisconsin hurriedly deployed from column of march into line of battle, there was no time to wait for the rest of the brigade to catch up, no time to wait for any of the men who hadn't yet finished loading. There was not a moment to lose, so Reynolds sent them charging straight into the trees, and he followed, urging them on.
Just as they reached the edge of the woods, a devastating volley erupted almost in their faces. The 14th Tennessee had cut loose at a range of 40 or 50 yards. Dozens of men from Wisconsin went down. The rest returned the fire. Reynolds was right there, spurring his horse up close behind the line. Reynolds reined his horse around toward the seminary to see if the other regiments of the Iron Brigade were coming up in support. Then, without a word, he slumped and toppled to the ground. Aides placed his body on a blanket and carried him from the field, while others dashed off to inform the senior division commander in the 1st Corps, Major General Abner Doubleday, who had just arrived on the scene ahead of his troops, that he was now in charge of the battlefield.
Meanwhile, the men of the 2nd Wisconsin pressed ahead, fighting their way forward through the increasingly bullet-torn and smoke-shrouded woodlot and driving the Tennesseans back before them. When a bullet shattered Colonel Fairchild's left elbow and Lieutenant Colonel George Stevens fell mortally wounded, Major John Mansfield suddenly found himself in command of the 2nd Wisconsin.
As the 2nd Wisconsin pressed its fight against the Confederates in the smoky confines of the Herbst woodlot, one by one the other regiments of the Iron Brigade came rushing past the seminary, deploying into line and loading their muskets on the run, then charging in on the left of the 2nd. With the arrival of each new Iron Brigade regiment, the situation of Archer's units became more and more desperate. Legend has it that one of the rebels grumbled, "There are those damned black-hatted fellows again. 'Tain't no militia, it's the Army of the Potomac."
An Iron Brigade officer later said that it was a, quote, unadorned, long, drawn-out line of ragged, dirty blue against the long, drawn-out line of dirty, ragged butternut, with no pomp of war about it and no show or style except our old black hats.
At any rate, Archer and his men had good reason to know they were in serious trouble. With the brigade's left checked by Cutler's Federals holding the McPherson farm and the center gradually being driven back by the 2nd Wisconsin, Archer's right was not only driven back, but flanked, enveloped, and all but swallowed up by the charge of the rest of the Iron Brigade, that is, the 7th Wisconsin, followed by the 19th Indiana, and then the 24th Michigan.
The only black-hatted Westerners missing from the fray were the men of the 6th Wisconsin, which had been held back as the divisional reserve.
Confederate resistance collapsed, and the fight turned into a foot race, with the Tennesseans and Alabamans thrashing their way back across Willoughby Run with the Black Hats in hot pursuit. A private in the 13th Alabama swore that, quote, "there were 20,000 Yanks down in among us, hollering surrender."
Several hundred of the rebels were taken prisoner, including a panting and disheveled James Archer, who was wrestled down just over on the far side of Willoughby Run by Private Patrick Maloney of Company G, 2nd Wisconsin.
His capture by Maloney meant that day Archer didn't get to go back and tell Harry Heath, "I told you so," but instead he earned the dubious distinction of becoming the first general officer in the Army of Northern Virginia to be captured on the field of battle since Robert E. Lee took command 13 months earlier.
The Iron Brigade pursued the fleeing remnants of Archer's brigade all the way over to the eastern slopes of Herbst Ridge before being ordered to pull back across the stream, back to McPherson's Ridge. When the color bearer of the 19th Indiana went down, Private Abraham Buckles had taken up the fallen banner and led the rush forward. He got so far out in front that the regiment's colonel had to yell repeatedly, "Come back with that flag." Another soldier in the 19th later summed up the action by saying, quote, "We went down at them pretty lively and captured a good many. The rest ran away."
Meanwhile, well, really simultaneously, with the fight for the Herbst woodlot and the Iron Brigade's pursuit of Archer's Confederates across Willoughby Run, a much different battle was raging north of the Chambersburg Pike between Davis's rebels and Cutler's Yankees. But we'll save that story for the next show.
However, we'll close this show with 2 postscripts to the story we've told in this episode. Sadly, Private Maloney was killed in action later in the day on July 1st, but his capture of Archer at least gives him a footnote in history.
And then, according to one of Abner Doubleday's aides, when James Archer was being taken to the rear, quote, "A guard brought him back to General Doubleday, who, in a very cordial manner, they having been cadets at West Point together, said, 'Good morning, Archer. How are you? I am glad to see you.' General Archer replied, 'Well, I am not glad to see you by a damned sight.'"
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Those Damned Black Hats, The Iron Brigade in the Gettysburg Campaign by Lance J. Hurtigan.
Don't forget you can find all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
We wanted to let you know that this past weekend we released Members Episode number 105, which was the 9th part in our series on Jeb Stuart's controversial ride to Gettysburg.
So the members of the Strawfoot Brigade can check that out. And speaking of the Strawfoot Brigade, we'd like to thank the newest batch of volunteers who have stepped up to support the podcast. Jonah, Jody, Dave, Glenn,
Sven, Tom, Carl, Tad, John,
James, David, Bill, and Don.
And also a big thank you to Bob, David, and Vic for their donations.
Thanks, guys.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. Rich and I do hope that you'll join us again next time. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.